Greetings, everyone. What an impressive conference. Let me start by thanking Masdar and everyone who's organized this impressive event, incredible dialogue. And for the next 45 minutes, we're going to be talking about the transportation revolution and what a revolution is underway. I'd say for the second half of the last century, transportation didn't change that much. We had internal combustion engines powering people from point to point, fairly static infrastructure, but in the last decade and in the decades ahead, we're at the cutting edge of some remarkable changes. And we have some of the leading experts, people who are involved in that revolution, who are going to be talking to us about what they're doing and their thoughts about what lies ahead in the next 45 minutes. I'm at Columbia University in New York City, where we're seeing some of these revolutions on an ongoing basis. But let me start by asking each of the panelists here just to introduce themselves and tell us what they're doing and why they're here. So let me start with Harj.
Thank you, David. My name is Harj Dhaliwal. I'm the Managing Director for Virgin Hyperloop One here in the Middle East and also in India as well. I'll kick off by giving a background of our business, our company, then our technology, just for those who aren't really aware, and where we are right now with the progress that we're making. So first of all, we are a startup company. We were founded in 2014. It all emanated from a white paper that Elon Musk put together in 2013 when he was stuck in traffic, and he decided that there must be better ways of traveling around the world in a much more energy efficient, sustainable manner. So he came up with this term Hyperloop, and effectively what it is, it's a big tube. We take the air out of that tube, we put a capsule in it, we levitate it using electromagnetic levitation, and then we propel it using electric. But once we've removed the air out of that tube and created a vacuum, semi-space conditions, we've removed the largest resistance that we find here on Earth. That's the air that we breathe around us. And once we've removed that, we use very little energy to actually move at very high speeds. So in a nutshell, that's what Hyperloop technology is. But more importantly, it allows us to provide connectivity like we've never seen before. The ability to be able to cover vast distances in small amounts of time or short time is a game changer. So for example, the ability to be able to travel from Dubai to Abu Dhabi to Riyadh in 48 minutes or under an hour, the ability to be able to go from Riyadh to Jeddah in about 48 minutes, up to Neo in 40 minutes, to be able to connect people where time and distance is no longer a barrier is really what we are setting out to achieve. So what have we done? We're the only company in the world that has actually built a full-scale Hyperloop facility. We're testing it outside Las Vegas. We've run 400 tests up until now. And this year is going to be a real milestone in terms of our technology development and rollout. We're also working on commercialization. We're working across the Middle East in KSA, here in the UAE, and also in India to introduce this technology to the world. Thank you very much.
Harj, thank you. Now, just a follow-up question. I mean, it sounds very futuristic, and I think many people might be skeptical about whether this is really achievable. And tell us, I mean, how far away do you think this is? What's the proof of concept plan ahead?
So the proof of concept has already been achieved. I mean, you know, anybody's welcome to go to our test facility. You'll see for yourself. There's a lot of information on the internet as well, and videos where we've demonstrated the flight techniques that we're using, levitation, propulsion, etc. and so on. So it's there. I think what we're now really doing is moving on into another era where we are really making this into a much, much more effective, efficient, and cost-effective solution. So we need to move on. We need to carry on with our testing program. And we need to demonstrate the benefits of technology that we now have at our fingertips. And I will reinforce this. 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, we couldn't do what we're doing right now. With AI technology, autonomous technology, robotic engineering, what we're now doing is integrating that into a single platform. And that enables us now to develop what we're doing. So we have a form of transport which is direct destination. It is fully autonomous. It actually links into smart cities, and we'll come back onto this later on in the panel.
Great.
Because energy efficiency and utilization is so important. So that's where we are right now, I think, David.
Thank you. Well, Mo, you're involved in a very different type of transportation revolution. Tell us about it.
Yes, we're more on the last and first mile solutions. So I'm the general manager of Lime in the UAE. And what we are doing at Lime is we're actually radically changing transportation, urban transportation, by offering electric scooters that enable cities to reduce emissions, reduce congestion, and increase access for their residents. How do we do that? We have dockless electric scooters that are placed across the city, and people just democratically access these scooters from their work, from their home, and use them to get between point A and point B for first and last mile trips. What first and last mile trips are essentially trips that are less than 3 miles or 5 kilometers. Right now, we're in over 120 cities across the world. Abu Dhabi is one of the cities that we're present in. We've done over 100 million trips so far across the world. And what's really exciting is that a lot of those trips are actually replacing car trips, right? So that actually helps in reducing emissions and reducing congestion as well. 1 in 4 trips on Lime scooters has replaced a car in the past year. So that's pretty much what we do.
And I think first reaction for some people might be that you've got a tough job doing this in Abu Dhabi where it's, 40 degrees, 45 degrees C during the summer. Tell us about this. Is this going to take off in Abu Dhabi?
I believe it will, absolutely. I think the value prop for such a weather is that it gets you from point A to point B faster than walking, right? So we are in other markets where we have the flip weather, where right now it's freezing and roads are slippery, and still people use us because our scooters are safe and are usable in such weather. So I project that as long as we can create value for commuters and for people to use us within the city, not only for leisure use case, we will have a continuing business across the year for people to actually utilize and take advantage of our scooters.
Peter, what are you doing at UPS?
Thanks, David, and good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I'm with UPS. We're a global logistics company. That means we move things around the planet. We don't make things, we move things. So in that sense, we enable trade to happen. We do quite a lot of it. We're a large company. We employ almost 500,000 people. Actually, about 3% of global GDP moves through our network in some shape or form. In the process of doing that, we use planes, trains, ships, and trucks. We have a global ground fleet of about 120,000 assets. So there's a lot going on. The challenge, or one of the big challenges, of course, in the middle of all that is how do we do that sustainably? And that's my job. I'm the International Sustainability Director. So to organize a business of that scale sustainably, it's all about innovation for us. It's about, firstly, being as efficient as we can with conventional technologies, and then going beyond that to things that are completely new. We have some interesting innovations and some world firsts in that space that I'll be excited to talk about.
And what technology areas do you find particularly exciting now in this whole revolution? What's UPS looking at that you think is most transformational?
So there's no single silver bullet, without a doubt. It's a combination of, on the efficiency side, there are some exciting things going on with big data, computing, unlocking opportunities that, to Harj's point, were not there even just a few years ago. On the alternative technology side, alternative fuels, how do we go beyond the diesel truck? Some exciting things with vehicle electrification, with power grids, with micromobility, the ability to do things without trucks at all. Renewable gas is another big opportunity for us. So it's a range of different things, and the key is finding how to optimize the balance of those different solutions.
George, you're involved in the finance piece of this. Tell us what you're excited about the work you do.
Sure, thank you. George Reid, I'm a partner at a private equity firm based in London called Zouk Capital. We've been in the industry now for about 20 years. Everything we focus is on around the sustainability agenda, renewable energy, and quote-unquote all things green. As a fund manager, we have, during the course of 2020, we're going to get to around about €1 billion of capital under management. Effectively, what we do is we create new investment vehicles. We pool capital from institutional investors who come to us to invest into our funds and our vehicles. And the latest initiative we have is a joint venture with the UK government, who have awarded us a £200 million investment into a fund to create a network of public EV charging infrastructure all across the UK. And indeed, our first private sector investor who came into that was our hosts today, Masdar. And during the course of this year, we'll be continuing to fundraise for that vehicle. Essentially, the view then is that we'll use that 400 million to roll out a network of public EV charging for members of the public in the UK market. About 37 million vehicles in the UK that need to decarbonize over the course of the next couple of decades. So our focus is really on decarbonizing that transport sector and also focusing on the clean air agenda within the towns and cities in the UK.
And are you doing private vehicles, fleet vehicles, taxis, buses? Where do you see this taking off in the UK?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, we will work with all those people. So they all need to decarbonize. So, the UK roads carry about 320 billion passenger miles a year. The vast majority of that is done through private cars, essentially. So it's about 5 million vans in the UK. They do much higher mileage than passenger cars. They're much better utilized, the UPS trucks and the like. But the answer is we will work with all of those to help them with their decarbonisation and effectively how they transition from fueling with diesel and petrol to using the electrical power grid to move them towards electric drivetrains across the piece.
I was struck at the opening ceremony here. There were 10 heads of state, and that was really remarkable, I think, convening power that this conference has. But it underscores the central role of policy and regulation in everything we're talking about, to have these governmental leaders here. And I wondered if any of you have any thoughts about the role of policy and regulation in the work you're doing, how important it is, what role it plays. How'd start with you?
Yeah, absolutely, David. I think, first of all, I think it's very important to understand as young companies, as startup companies, we have to raise money from fund managers, as we just mentioned here, and we have to get that equity. That generally comes in from private sources, and that's a finite amount of money that you're working with. So you are not only challenged with the innovation that you are trying to introduce, which has never been done, but at the same time, you've got this constraint and the clock ticking with respect to the funding and financing. On top of that, then, what you are doing is something that's never been done. So therefore, there needs to be an obligation, responsibility from governments to be able to work with new innovators to ensure that regulation is changing or is going to keep up to speed, up to pace with what is being introduced. And we are now finding that, having raised $400 million through private equity, every single dollar is private money. So we've got a great bunch of investors that believe in what we're actually doing. What we are now doing is convincing and moving governments to work with us, because Hyperloop actually is a crossover from space, aerospace, and high-speed rail. It's a classic of this discussion that we're having now on regulation. Where does regulation fit? And it's a dilemma that governments are looking at and they've started to work with us. So in the US, the Department of Transport, Secretary of State has set up a commission to specifically look at regulation. The Director General for Mobility in Europe has done the same. And in India, where we're working, we're actually now got the Principal Scientific Advisor for the Government of India to set up a commission to start looking at regulation. But it needs to keep up to speed and up to pace with the way the technology is being developed, because if it doesn't, then two things are going to happen. Either we're going to run out of money and we'll stop, or what's going to happen is that somewhere down the line, we've got to backtrack out of something that is not going to be acceptable to a regulator. So it's a huge role that needs to be played to keep innovation going, to enable us to push forward on some of the sustainability, some of the energy, some of all the big things that we're now talking about at this conference.
And just on Hyperloop, I would think you would need land corridors in order to make this work, and you need to work closely with governments to acquire that land. Is that right? And
Yeah, I mean, land is a big part of it. So it's a partnership, and this is why I think regulation is one part of it. Building any kind of linear project over a long distance is another part of it. So you can't do it in isolation. We can do the technology, but we can't do the technology without getting guidance from governments on regulation. We can't build anything without governments. That's a fact. So, you know, there's a huge role that we are working with governments, convincing them to work along with us. And it's happening, but it's the pace that it's got to happen to really move forward. I'll give you an example. None of us are going to stop traveling. Transport is not going to stop. We are going to continue. By 2040, transport trips are going to double to what we're doing right now globally. Okay? Here we are now. And if you look at the emissions that actually come out from transportation alone, so globally, we all know transport accounts for about 15% of CO2 emissions. In the developed countries, it's 30%. Okay? Now that is, I'll put some figures on it. So what is that 30% in developed countries? It's 7 gigatons of carbon dioxide being emitted since 2010. So just to put some framework on it. So that's since 2010. Now, what is 7 gigatons? People don't even know what it is. I'll tell you what it is. It's the weight of 7 billion people multiplied by 20. So that's what we've been churning out to date. It's going to double by the time we get to 2040. So we have to look at transport. We have to look at the way we are actually, you know, our behaviors are moving forward. And more importantly, it's not about passengers. It's also about cargo. And I'm going to let Peter come into this. Because cargo and e-commerce is another big driver. And I'll let the rest of the panel come on this. Because it's not just about people. It's about our behaviors and what's happening to logistics of the future.
There's a lot to follow up on there. Peter, do you want to pick up on the transport topic? And,
yeah, so from a policy perspective then, David, let me start in more general terms. I think what I would characterize what we're looking for from governments around the world is joined up thinking that enables progress. That's the key. So let me give you a couple of examples of how that can work well and perhaps not so well in different circumstances. So I mentioned earlier that one of the things that we're innovating in is the field of alternative fuels, alternative technologies to go beyond diesel, and in some cases beyond the truck. And we have this concept called the rolling laboratory, which is the proportion of our ground fleet that is operating on these advanced technologies. About 10,000 vehicles now across the world in our fleet are on something other than conventional diesel or petrol. So we're really trying to do this at scale. And we've set ourselves a goal that this year, in 2020, a quarter of everything that we buy new into our global ground fleet will be on some form of advanced technology or alternative fuel. So we're really trying to move the numbers on these things. It's beyond experimentation, it's beyond piloting, it's really moving to scale. But to do that, very often what happens is that you find that the areas, unexpected areas of roadblocks crop up. Give me an example within the field of vehicle electrification. EVs will be a big part of our future, particularly for last mile. Urban collection and delivery electrification works extremely well in that field. One of the difficulties there is getting enough power into our buildings to be able to recharge our vehicles overnight. When you start to explore that game, and this is where, interestingly, the transportation and the energy sectors start to overlap in a fascinating way. When you start to explore that game, you find yourself in the world of grid upgrades, power grid upgrades, to solve local pinch points. The market that supports that structure in certain countries around the world, a lot of countries around the world, is, I would argue, dysfunctional would be the best description of it. It requires, for example, the end user to support all of the upstream upgrade costs, whether they be substations, ring main units, cabling, etc. That's a massive disincentive for my sector, my industry, to invest in electrification. Some of that can be overcome through the use of technologies. We've developed a smart grid technology, which is a world first at the scale that we've deployed it, but we still need the ability to do upgrades. So that's the kind of example where joined up thinking across government departments is going to be really important going forwards. It's no longer going to be good enough for transportation to be separate from energy. Transportation departments have to learn to talk to energy departments and realize how the two sectors are coming together. Finance is another key thing. We mentioned, you know, money flows. Some of these technologies just don't pay for themselves straight out of the box. And I think government has a role to step in and help get technologies through what I would call the valley of death, that period of time when they can't pay for themselves, to build scale. And there are some really good examples around the world of where we've been able to work with governments to achieve that. We need to see more of that because ultimately everybody wins. If we can get these technologies through the valley of death and build scale, then for sure we're able to deploy more, but then society benefits and government benefits on the back of that through social enhancement. So these are the kinds of things that are needed. Enabling joined-up government is what we're looking for. It's good and it's bad at the same time in different parts of the world. Let's see more harmonization.
George, you're working in some similar areas with electric vehicles. How does policy affect the work you do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the UK government is our biggest investor, so obviously I'm going to say that they're doing a fantastic job. But yeah, I think the point around the long-term view. So we're trying to transition 37 million vehicles from petrol and diesel to electric. That's not something that's going to happen quickly. It's going to take some time. So you need a policy and a regulatory environment that also spans over a decent period of time, and it provides certainty, and it doesn't chop and change and backtrack. And when you're building these large infrastructure projects, infrastructure investors like us and the people that we represent, they want stability, they want consistency, because if you don't have stability and consistency, that in our world means risk, and risk means it costs more. If it costs more, it means that your money is at risk and you expect a higher return, and that then puts the strain on the economics of projects and ventures that you look to try and do. The UK market specifically, it has a 2050 net zero carbon target. It's the first industrialized country in the world to have written that into legally binding law. It is aiming to have all electric, conventionally fueled vehicles off the road by 2050. It's going to be banning the sale on new vehicles between 2035 and 2040. And they have a plethora of incentives in the market at the moment around capital grants, road tax policies, company car benefit schemes. So when you kind of knit all of that together, it actually creates quite a nice policy policy environment for the consumer. And ultimately, that helps us when it comes to building these public networks. It helps the corporates decide on what their approach is going to be to decarbonising their fleet. And then at even bigger scale, you have projects like Hyperloop and these big sort of rail projects as well that we see in the UK. But consistency and that long-term view is absolutely critical for all aspects of these transitions that we're looking at.
And a follow-up question for either or both of you from the UK. It looks like Brexit is happening. Is Brexit going to affect this whole agenda, and if so, how?
Well, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, my view is, again, coming back to the kind of long-term view, I think Brexit will create some noise for a period, but fundamentally, as I say, we do 320 billion miles in the UK. We're not suddenly going to stop doing those miles. The issue around carbon emissions that come from these vehicles and the carbon intensity of our transport system, the air quality and clean air agenda, those aren't things in our consumer habits that are suddenly going to disappear or drop off the importance and drop off the radar. We've had the most environmentally focused election very recently in the UK, so that kind of consumer mentality around the whole transition and the need to decarbonize our economy more generally, I think is something that people will see through. So I think there's bound to be a little bit of noise around sort of trade and vehicle deliveries and so on and so forth, but I'd like to think that's something that's it's no more than noise. It doesn't kind of take us off our long-term trajectory, would be my view.
Yeah, and I would just say that we will continue to support our customers regardless of the framework that we need to operate within. That's just the reality of life. And I think the challenges that we're talking about here this morning are largely independent of those frameworks. I'd just like to make one other point to add to my earlier comments, which is a more locally focused point. We've had some very encouraging meetings with the Department for Climate Change and Environment here in the UAE. And I'm really genuinely hopeful and anticipative of there being a really good example here of some of the joined-up government that we were talking about earlier. I see some really visionary thinking around the deployment of renewable energy. So I think this could be really a great place for the innovation in transportation. There are some good signs.
Mo, does policy affect your work with Lime scooters?
Absolutely.
How so?
Absolutely. You probably read a lot of news about this topic, but I think, what my colleague said, stability and pace of developing policy for new types of transport means is very critical. I would like just to point out to some examples. So So we've looked at INRIX research, the data and analytics firm. They've done a research in 2019 on 50 million car trips in the US and 50 million car trips in Germany, and similarly in the UK. They learned that 24 million of the 50 million trips, so 48%, are actually less than 3 miles, right? So micromobility space. So imagine just cutting out or reducing that type of volume of cars and congestion and emissions that could happen. That could improve life for people, and it could improve just the urban setting for a certain city. Mm-hmm. So for us to kind of help cities move into alternative means of transport, like electric scooters, we need the stability, and we need that governments actually keep up with the pace that we move at as startups. And this is where the biggest challenge is. Usually startups move super fast. And bureaucracy in governments is, you know, as you can imagine, it's longer, right? The pace of getting things done. So we kind of need to marry and meet somewhere halfway, where we can keep up with the pace of the startups that are helping improve the environment in these markets.
And David, can I just add to that comment about, because you mentioned micromobility, and actually perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, micromobility is also coming to the world of the movement of goods. It's not just about the movement of people. So we're finding ways, for example, in which we can now eliminate last mile trucks altogether and replace them with cycle-based solutions. They're not cycles as you might imagine them. They are typically electrically assisted devices that are able to carry a significant amount of cargo, but they are still cycles in technological and in legal terms. And this is a really interesting revolution, because it kind of links in with the whole movement towards walkability, cyclability, urban livable spaces, green spaces in our cities, but takes it beyond people and takes it into the world of the movement of goods. And actually, as a partner of Expo in Dubai later this year, we're going to be bringing some of our latest thinking on micromobility to Expo. We're developing in conjunction with some partners a four-wheeled micromobility solution, an electrically assisted quad cycle. So we'll be very excited to show that at Expo. But it does actually illustrate the point about joined-up thinking as well.
Peter, are these autonomous vehicles, or are these with human beings on the scooters?
No, they are with drivers, with riders, that's right. But it does perhaps, as you quite rightly indicate, pave the way towards a certain amount of autonomous technology in the future. You see that coming relatively soon or not, with autonomous delivery? So the autonomous revolution is indeed moving rapidly towards us in technological terms. In fact, we see a lot of it already today in the shape of driver assistance technologies, which are some of the stepping stones towards full autonomy. What's interesting, perhaps from a UPS perspective, is that autonomous last mile, for example, let's take that as one of the areas which is going to be perhaps most interesting. It's not going to be all about removing the driver or the service provider altogether, because number one, that last 10 meters, if you like, of delivery is extremely difficult to automate. And also, our customers constantly tell us that they really value that human interface for that last piece of the delivery. So for us, it's going to be more about how do we take out the pieces of the driver's job that are just not efficient. So for example, the business of getting the delivery vehicle from our operating depot to the downtown location. That would be perhaps more of a candidate for being automized than the last part of the delivery, where we still really need that service provider. So it's really more about making better use of the people, the excellent people that we have, and letting them focus on what they do really well, which is meeting and excelling the needs of our customers. We're down to our last 5 minutes or so, and we're here at the Future Sustainability Summit, so I thought we'd just focus on sustainability maybe for our last 5 minutes. And Harj, tell us about sustainability, energy use, carbon emissions associated with Hyperloop, maybe just in a minute or two. Okay. And then I'm curious about electric vehicles in the UK as well.
Yeah, absolutely, David. I just want to sort of highlight, first of all, I sort of described how the technology works and why it's so efficient from an energy perspective. But again, in terms of figures, we are 10 times more energy efficient than aircraft, and we're 50% less energy use than high-speed rail. but at twice the speed. So that just gives some context. I think what I want to sort of highlight is that the technology that we're using is linear. So we've got tubes that are running hundreds of kilometers, which gives us a lot of surface space. And what we are now developing are very advanced photovoltaics, wraps as we call them, which will go around our tubes. And then they will, in climates like here in the Middle East and India and some parts of the US, allow us to generate solar renewable energy into our grid. Now, from what we've calculated, we will actually be producing more energy due to the distances that these photovoltaics will be wrapped around. We'll be producing more energy than what we require to run the system. So effectively, we're unplugged from the grid. So we will not be putting the loading that I think, Peter, you mentioned earlier on in terms of what happens with electric vehicles. You come in and you want to charge them all in one go. Well, if you actually start looking at renewables, you start looking at solar, you start building that in, you have a very low energy base in terms of usage, then I think we're also into a different ball game. So that's what we're doing. We're going to be unplugged. We'll be a net positive contributor back into the grid. One other thing I want to say is smart cities. And smart cities like Dubai, like Abu Dhabi, and like the UAE, what does it really mean? It really means that what you are doing is creating an integrated platform where the traveler is agnostic to the way he travels, okay? What systems of the future and our system will be doing is monitoring, using big data from smart cities in real time, understanding what is happening, what is the demand in 2 hours, 5 hours, 24 hours, and using autonomous AI technology, making the changes, adapting the system to match demand, which means on a system which is direct to destination, every vehicle only goes to where it wants to go, you are now effectively very highly utilized. So you couple big data, smart cities, big data, highly efficiently utilized transport systems, and then solar energy on top, I think you have a very efficient system.
And George, sometimes hear concerns about electric vehicles plugged into coal plants producing relatively high emissions. What are your thoughts on that? And how can we make sure electrification is sustainable?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it comes back a little bit to the whole joined-up approach and looking at the ecosystem as a whole. So you have to ask yourself the question, what is the carbon intensity of my energy mix and my grid? So the UK has been through 10, 15, 20 years now of rapid decarbonisation of energy, and we actually have a very low carbon intensity for the megawatts and the gigawatt hours that we put into the grid. So, you know, we're a sustainability-focused fund manager. We've done this for 20 years now. Our commitment to our fund is that we're only going to charge our vehicles with renewable energy. So there is no point in turning a coal-fired power station on to try and pretend that you're decarbonising the transport sector. You're just shifting the issue back to the energy sector. And actually, there's some pretty interesting stats, I think, that will come out of this. So 2020, I think, will see the first year for the UK where renewables across the year will produce more of our energy than gas for the first time ever. So our renewable penetration is consistently getting higher and higher. And you have kind of levelized cost of energy in offshore wind. The UK has very high offshore wind resources. So combining all of that together is really interesting. And there's also technical innovation at a much smaller level. So, you know, there are applications out there now where if you have your electric car plugged in at home, you can actually pick a window of time overnight to charge your power or charge your battery when the power on the grid is the lowest possible carbon intensity. So if you're one of these consumers who really wants to focus on making a difference, you can pick the windows when carbon intensity is low because the turbines are spinning and so on and so forth. And that allows you to really drive that down. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, is the clean air angle. So you've got decarbonisation and you've got clean air. And we shouldn't forget about clean air. That's a local health-related issue, which is solved when you remove these tailpipe emissions.
Peter, any closing thoughts about how UPS promotes sustainability overall? You've spoken a little bit about it, but I think you got the last word here.
So it's a really exciting space that's moving very quickly. I'll just pick up on one point that George made there about the interconnection with the grid. We're just starting an experiment, it's in London actually, where we're going to be developing some software that will allow us to cooperate with the grid supplier, the energy supplier, to determine exactly when we pull energy off the grid to recharge our vehicles, and able to do that at a time when it's most beneficial for the grid and therefore lowest cost for us. And the exciting thing about that is that brings down the cost of the deployment of EVs and puts us closer to the point where we can really We're getting close to the point now, we're not quite there, but we're getting close to the point where the deployment of an EV is not just the sustainable solution, but it's the commercially rational solution. That's the bridge that we need to cross. Once we get there, then the rate of scale up takes a hockey stick shape.
Maybe I'll say just one thing on that. I think there's a perception that maybe when you come to looking at sustainability that you sacrifice the commerciality or the kind of money that you can make in these things. That is absolutely not the case with sustainability. And the ability to integrate the two means that you can still make attractive financial returns if that's your particular focus as an investor. And I think that's a really good point.
Well, I feel like we've scratched the surface here, but just gives an indication of the exciting revolution that's ahead. Everything from electrification of transport to revolutions in e-commerce to scooters to Hyperloop. It's really quite a remarkable set of changes that are coming. Please join me in giving our panelists a big hand. And that concludes this panel, and now I'd like to invite Alan Nelson to the stage.